Hello and welcome to Lords of the Sith. My name is Lee, and today I'm here with Denise.
Hello, everybody.
And we're going to be doing an episode that I have been wanting to do forever, and it's an episode discussing the psychology behind the characterizations of Kylo Ren, Rey, and Finn.
I think they really like, especially Finn as a foil to Kylo and Rey and how. So I think it's really important to look at them both. I'm here just to do story analysis and no psychology. And if she says anything too complicated, I'll try to make her clarify it.
Sounds good. So the premise for today's episode is that the three leads of the sequel trilogy, meaning Rey, Finn, and Kylo Ren, all share one important element in their character design, which is the same core conflict. And we're going to be analyzing how that conflict has played out in completely different ways for the three of them because of their character traits, their personality, their temperament, as well as their life situation, their environment, and the tools and the weaknesses that they each have. And for me, what's awesome about that is that it's an added layer of connectedness between the three of them that is basically the foundation to the three characterizations. And we're going to be talking about personality clusters. We're going to be looking at a little bit of psychoanalytical theory, but it's not going to be a master class. You don't have to have any sort of background in psychology to be able to follow along the conversation. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about the core conflict, which is shared by all the three leads. And then we're going to go into the characterization of Kylo Ren. And next we're going to talk about Rey. And then we're going to talk about Finn. Once we cover that aspect, we're going to move on into how we see these arcs playing out in episode 9, going by the storytelling premise that if you have a conflict unfold, then you expect to see a resolution of sorts at the end of the story. So we're going to look at it from a psychodynamic perspective and from a storytelling perspective. So let's get started. Ben Solo, Rey, and Finn, they have the same trauma at the core of their character arc, which is abandonment. For Ben Solo, it's an emotional abandonment that he perceives. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying I believe that's how he perceived it. And for Rey, she was literally abandoned on Jakku. At least that's what we're told. We still don't know if that's the case. And for Finn, even though he wasn't abandoned, he was taken from his family. Children perceive a separation as abandonment a lot of the time. Children need their parents. They need love. And when they are separated, they just don't understand, and they tend to think it's because they're not wanted, they're not loved. And that's very painful. So with Finn, we can speculate that on a subconscious level, he may have perceived that his family didn't go rescue him, they didn't go save him, they let him be taken away, is a form of abandonment for him. So they share this, but because they have different temperaments and they're in different environments and they have different life experiences, that develops into their conflict in a completely different way for the three characters. Important to note, we all are born with our temperament. So we come kind of pre-programmed to have a certain type of temperament. With that and our life experiences, how we are treated by others, things that happen to us, and the environment that we're in, then we develop a personality. And we say the personality is formed by age 18. So we don't diagnose people with personality disorder before they're 18, but we see traits, right? If you have abandonment during childhood, that can affect to varying degrees, depending on the person again and what happens after that. But it does affect your way of thinking about yourself and relating to others and forming attachments. So we're going to go into that in depth for each character. I think it's pretty commonly accepted that Kylo Ren has narcissistic traits. I don't think he has narcissistic personality disorder, and I'll go into that later. But I do think that Kylo Ren is a narcissistic projection of Ben Solo, which is part of why he's so fascinating as a character to me, because he's just so complex, right? We'll get more into him shortly. With Rey, her temperament is different from Ben Solo, and the situations that she was in are different. Instead of going into a narcissistic structure, what she does is she becomes very avoidant. She thinks, oh, so they abandoned me here because I'm not good enough, and that means that I'm probably going to be abandoned again if I trust and if I love. So if you have that belief on a subconscious level, that can potentially prevent attachments from forming in a deep way. So Rey is very charming. She's very attractive. She can easily draw people to her. People can connect with her very easily, but very superficially. When it comes time to deepen those attachments, and we see that time and time again, she becomes very avoidant. She legit runs away. Out of the three leads, Finn is the one that's most superficially developed by the story, unfortunately. So we know kind of very little about his inner world, unfortunately. But just going by the way that he imprinted on Rey after meeting her for like 2 days, you know, he follows her around like a duckling, and he's ready to risk his life and just follow her wherever she goes in the galaxy because he's so quickly formed this very deep attachment with her. There's obviously some issues there with attachment and identity. We're going to talk more about each of these three characters individually. The main thing is to keep in mind that they are all three lost, kind of abandoned children. That's what's at the core of the character. What's so brilliant about setting up the conflict for the three of them in this way is that the conflict is still the same. So they're really looking for the same thing at the end of the day. And what that tells us is that they're more similar than might appear at first glance. Another really interesting shared design element between Kylo Ren, Rey, and Finn is that all three of them, once they were abandoned, air quotes, once they were abandoned, they were all subject to an abusive and exploitative relationship with a pseudo-parent figure. So a parental figure who is really just providing, the bare necessities of food, clothes, and shelter, but is not providing emotional support, or is providing a twisted emotional support in the case of Kylo Ren that is actually abusive as well. So for Finn, it's the first order. Finn was basically taken from his family. He's a little boy. And by the way, that was the thing that made me really love Finn and care about him and root for him, was that moment when we see Hux and Phasma going through his files and you see little baby Finn at the corner of the screen and how he develops from a little baby into the adult Finn. It's heartbreaking. He was taken from his family. He's a little kid. He doesn't have a parent figure, so the institution becomes the parent. And he's betrayed that parent figure by running away and joining the enemies of the parent figure. So he has to have feelings about that, and we don't get to see it. With Rey, you have Unkar Plutt. Yeah. And Jakku itself, the place that she doesn't want to abandon, but really she doesn't belong there. Unkar Plutt. They left her with him when she was 5, and he provides the food, the nourishment. But he's an abusive, exploitative figure as well. And then with Kylo Ren, of course, we have Snoke providing that paternal figure, but also being emotionally abusive and maybe even physically abusive, just telling him you're no good, but you're great. Kind of idealizing him and devaluating him. So that helps to basically make his conflict all the more worse, and it informs his opinion of himself as well, because he was in a vulnerable age when he met Snoke. Something else about the dynamic between Kylo and Snoke that I think is pretty interesting is that if you remember in The Last Jedi, Yoda tells Luke that as teachers, as masters, we are what they grow beyond. So the idea that when you're teaching somebody, you are helping them develop their potential to the point where they learn from your mistakes and become greater than you, ideally, right? And with Snoke and Kylo, it's actually just the opposite. For Snoke, it would be dangerous if Kylo Ren ever surpasses him. The Master's in the dark side of the Force. The teacher-apprentice relationship is very interesting because the Master is trying to help you develop and grow in the Force, but not too much. Not to the point where you're going to surpass them and usurp them or kill them. It's really a life insurance policy. For Snoke, he really wants to keep Kylo Ren in conflict. He wants to keep him divided and fighting himself because that's his way of keeping Kylo contained and under control. So if Kylo is the best version of himself, that poses a threat for Snoke. There's an added layer of just kind of a sinister perversion of what's supposed to be an ideal relationship between master and apprentice, between father and son, as he is a father figure to Kylo Ren. That's really the basic setup for the three of them. The fact that it is so similar and that's the foundation to each character, I think that's masterful. For me, as a side geek and as somebody who loves storytelling, all the ingredients are there for, an amazingly satisfying story. And obviously this was well thought out from the beginning. It's not a coincidence. Somebody read up on childhood development and psychodynamic theories. And by the way, guys, in that episode of Women in Star Wars where we're talking about our experiences in the fandom, what we were doing up all night talking in the Reylo thread in 2016, this was it. This was the kind of conversation that we were having. Now we're going to go in and talk about each individual character more in depth, and we're going to just talk about what makes the conflict tick for each of them and how that plays out. Of course, we're going to start with everybody's favorite, Kylo Ren. Yay! So what I want to do is talk about him in terms of one of my favorite analysts, who is Heinz Kohut, who did really nice work talking about narcissistic personality disorder, basically the mechanism for that to happen. But I want to clarify before we even start that I don't think we can diagnose Kylo Ren with a personality disorder, because Kylo Ren is not a real person. Kylo Ren is a character. We're not going to be diagnosing any characters here. I don't like that when I see it, and I'll tell you why. Characters are not real people, and with real people, we are very careful to take a very detailed history of their development and their life experiences and their symptomatology before we dare to diagnose them. And we do it for purposes of understanding how to help them. We don't do it just to put a label on somebody. And so with characters, if you just tag on a diagnosis and say, oh, this person has this personality disorder, it really, for me, just contributes to the stigma. And there's already a tremendous stigma on characterological vulnerabilities because we tend to hear about the dramatic and super pathological presentations. We don't always hear about the struggles. And the same holds true for other mental illness. So I want to be very careful. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that Kylo Ren has a narcissistic personality disorder. I'm saying that he has been coded as somebody who has narcissistic traits. And I think that was brilliant of them to do that. And it makes perfect sense. I'll explain why. But I'm not diagnosing him. So what we're going to do is that we're going to look at narcissistic personality disorder so that we can understand the traits that are present in Kylo Ren as a way of understanding the character and understanding a little bit more about the psychology behind it. So when we talk about psychology, it's basically a bunch of theories that people came up with. And we use each theory as a lens. It's really helpful in a way to formulate or to understand what's going on, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily right. It's just that person's way of framing things. And we learn about that because it helps us to think through and understand the mechanism a little bit better. There's plenty of thinkers out there, there's plenty of theories. My favorite model for the approach to narcissism is the Heinz Kohut self-psychology model because I think it's the most comprehensive and the most kind. It's a very compassionate approach. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We won't get too into it. We'll just talk about it as it's relevant to Kylo Ren. When we are children, we are developing what's called a schema, meaning like a blueprint for how we expect the world is going to be. So based on how our parents treat us or the parental figures treat us, we learn to treat ourselves, and we learn about what's going on outside of our home by the dynamics that are playing out inside of our house. So because as children, we're basically like a sponge absorbing everything. So we make assumptions about the world based on what we are familiar with firsthand. So for example, I can tell you an example of my own life. When I was a kid, I had a lot of really bad asthma and had a lot of allergies. I had allergic rhinitis, so I had a stuffy nose frequently. And I assumed everybody had the same thing. When I actually got those issues taken care of as I grew out of my allergies, I started breathing normally through my nose, and I realized this is actually how everybody else breathes because we look at things as children through the lens of what I experienced must be what everybody else experiences. So the way mommy and daddy treat each other and treat me is what I can expect of the world. As we get older, we learn, we gain perspective, we gain the ability to abstract, and we gain the ability to see from another point of view. But one of the core beliefs in psychoanalytic theory is that those schemas, so those shorthands or blueprints that we built for ourselves based on our early development remain at the core of our subconscious. So they inform our opinions of the world and of ourselves, even if we have intellectually come to realize not everybody had this upbringing that I had. Deep down, we are expecting to be treated the way our parents treated us. So that's basically the core there. With Heinz Kohut, he really looks at the parent-child, what we call a dyad, so the two come as a set. And he really looks at that dynamic and its successes or its failures to inform the development of narcissism. One thing I really like about Heinz Kohut's theory is that he proposes that there's a healthy narcissism, because if you think about it, we're all the center of our own universe, basically, right? So our ego, to be healthy, we have to be, to some extent, narcissistic. But that spectrum continues into a pathological narcissism, which is the personality disorder. So in a sense of healthy narcissism, we talk about the importance of having the mother figure or the main parent, now we think, right? But back then they used to say mother, reflect to the child that he is special, that he is loved, and that he's important. And then that way the child can internalize that and have a healthy self-esteem. So you can imagine that if that process is disrupted, that won't happen. And then the child can grow up with a sense of inferiority that then they later can build a structure around, basically like an armor around that, which is a structure of narcissism to conceal what they believe is the flaw at their core. Does that sound a little bit like Kylo Ren?
Yeah, because it seems, I wouldn't say that he didn't have this loving thing, but you have Snoke and something poisoning him. But yeah, he does have an armor hiding something soft and vulnerable inside, definitely.
I think this is a very interesting conversation for the two of us to have, Denise, because you and and I have disagreed on this before. I remember you were saying that you didn't like the idea of blaming Leia for what happened with Kylo, because she's a working mom, basically, right?
Yeah.
And that's not how we want to view our heroine. We don't want to think of like, oh, because she was an absentee parent, Kylo Ren became a murderer. Nobody wants to think that. And I don't think we can say that's the case. That being said, when we talk about childhood neglect, it's not necessarily because the mother didn't love the child, but simply if she isn't there enough, or if the child doesn't perceive that their needs are being met in the way they need. Now, it's interesting, there's some studies in narcissistic personality disorder that show that people who are more vulnerable to developing that are predominantly men, and men who were overly sensitive as children. So when we talk about overly sensitive children, meaning somebody who really needs extra support, maybe, also more vulnerable than peers when they don't receive that added support. So more distressed by rejection or lack of a healthy support. So in a sense, that it's not just that there wasn't enough support, it's that there was a vulnerability that made them more affected. So when you think about mental illness, in many ways it's a perfect storm. All these factors have to be present, not just genetics, but also situational and temperament and personality. All this stuff can play into how things shape out. But going back to the topic of sensitivity, in the story, they've tried to let us know by giving us these big hints that Ben Solo is a sensitive child. He was a boy who was very gentle, and he loved calligraphy, and he had these really beautiful, nice traits. He obviously had a close relationship with Leia.
There's also an art, and it shows Ben in white and the other Padawans wearing like darker colors, and I thought it was really interesting that he was the only one in white, and white is meaningful, right? Cinema, it's language, and also in the movie The Last Jedi, he's in white, right? So he has this purity.
So Ben is a sensitive child who's very gifted. It's very important for a child's healthy development for the child to be made to feel like they are special and important, but that has to be consistent, right? So we call, Heinz Kohut calls mirroring. So picture a mother and her baby, and the mother is holding the baby and just basking in how perfect and wonderful and gorgeous he is, and how blessed she is to have him, and all this stuff, just looking at this baby, and her eyes are full of love, and the child receives that love and that sense that I'm awesome and you love me, you know, and it can come across in little ways, like, for example, like, oh my God, you pooped, you're so great, you know. You think about how people talk to their kids and their pets, that sense of kind of babying you, but also admiring you, and you're so great, that helps the child to integrate a healthy self-esteem. But if you only get that in spurts because mom is traveling a lot of the time, or mom is being a general, or whatever, and you're left with the droid, and children a lot of the times tend to assume that whatever is going on in their world is because of them. So the idea that if mom's not here, it's because maybe I'm not good enough to spend time with, kind of thing. So that could have happened. And then you have Han, who we know was kind of restless in a way. Have you read The Last Shot or anything like that?
I haven't.
I haven't either. I have heard the main plot points there, and I didn't want to spoil it for you, but did you hear about the droid, the attempted assassination on Ben Solo?
No, I didn't.
Okay. The Last Shot contains a sequence where a droid has been tasked to murder Ben Solo. And Ben Solo is maybe 2 years old or 3 years old, and he's in the kitchen with the droid. It's told from the perspective of the droid. He's thinking about where he's going to cut Ben Solo's neck to kill him. And as he's approaching Ben, already planning and extending, you know, his arm, Ben uses the Force to defend himself. And the droid's mind is kind of blanked out for a second. And when he looks at baby Ben, you know, his eyelashes are wet with tears and he's crying. And the droid thinks, what happened? You know, oh, I'm supposed to make breakfast for baby Ben. It's really sinister. It's really awful, and it's heartbreaking. That tells you a lot about what was going on in that home. I'm not saying that it's right that they took that approach, but I think that is the approach that they took to show us that Ben's needs emotionally weren't necessarily met. He could have been the most beloved child in the world, but if mom is not there to show him that, if dad is not there to show him that, and we have a murderous droid with him, that constitutes a form of neglect that's unintended, I believe, because these are our heroes, right? We don't want to think that they don't care about their kid. Of course they love him, but I think that is part of the reason why Kylo is the way he is today. Part of it, not all of it. There's something else very interesting about the mother-son relationship that I think think hasn't been explored enough, and I hope will be later on, which is the fact that Leia had a lot of unresolved feelings towards Darth Vader, and she feared that Ben Solo would fall to the dark side like Anakin did, and that's part of what motivated her to send him away to Luke. So in her relationship with Ben, there's a lot of love, but there's also fear about who he's going to become and that darkness that is in him. Children are very perceptive. So if Ben grows up sensing his mom's fear and uneasiness around him, he might not understand that it's not because she thinks I'm bad. He may believe that's the case. And this is going a little bit deeper into psychoanalytical theory, but when we think about the subconscious and the conscious, I like to describe it as if it were an iceberg. So we only see the tip of the iceberg, but under the surface, the subconscious is the base, that massive structure of the iceberg that we can't really see, but we can kind of guess at. So the tip of the iceberg is the conscious, and the base under the surface is the subconscious. When we are threatened in some way, our subconscious will raise up defenses. One of the defenses that is what we call primitive defense is something that's called splitting. And splitting is basically dividing into the good one and the bad one. And a lot of the time, splitting goes into projection, which is where I split the bad part of myself and I project it onto another person and I say, you're the bad one, I'm good, you're bad. And that's another primitive defense.
Just a question, because everything you said up to now I understand, but how would splitting work like for a regular person, for example? Because I don't understand how you could split into good and bad. Can you explain a little bit?
Let's take Kylo Ren as an example. So when we think about Kylo Ren, he is basically a projection of the evil inside of Ben Solo. So he is very much Ben Solo, but he is the bad part of Ben Solo, and he was created by Ben Solo as a defense. My approach to thinking of that characterization is to say that Ben Solo grew up with the sense that he was bad because of how he was treated, and because of maybe he sensed his own darkness. Maybe Snoke told him things, and so he grew up with this idea that even though he wanted to be good, there was something bad inside of him. So now he decides to split that bad part of him and take it out of himself and create the persona of Kylo Ren, who embraces that darkness. Rather than be afraid of becoming bad, he embraces it, and then he inhabits this persona. And that Kylo Ren person is supposed to be strong. He is not weak and foolish like his father, and he can survive. And he is not going to be alone. He's not going to be needing love. He's not going to be trying to run after the light. He's going to be embracing, the badness, the dark side, the power, and he can't be hurt. At least that's the idea behind that split. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So that's how I think Kylo Ren came to be. Of course, I think Snoke played a large part. So that's why I say we can't blame the parents. We can't say, when you think about it, all of these elements had to happen for this to be the end point. It had to be some maternal and paternal emotional neglect unintended. Again, I want to stress that because I'm not saying it's their fault. It had to be Ben Solo being a very sensitive child who also knew himself to be special, probably because he was told, that he was special. But then he wasn't given the emotional feedback to support him and to make him really believe it. So he felt, maybe I am weak deep down, I'm flawed, and that's why, they don't want to be with me, and that's why they send me away to Uncle Luke. Then Uncle Luke himself has some weird dynamics with Ben Solo, which I don't understand, but I embrace them because that's the story, right? So curiously, Luke somehow, instead of understanding Ben has some darkness in him, I want to save him like I did my dad.
Of course.
He rejects Ben and otherizes Ben. He has darkness in him. He's bad. And I'm sure that Ben Solo picked up on that in some way.
I see.
Because he's powerful in the Force and because he's a sensitive kid, meaning that he's very aware to how people are responding to him.
I'm just gonna say that maybe I'm trying to fix The Last Jedi, but the impression that I got wasn't that Luke rejected him, but it was more like Kylo's own fears, Yeah, Luke had this fleeting moment where that was worse than rejecting, but and then he's like, if Kylo goes there thinking that everybody hates him and that he's bad and that, it makes it like bigger than, it was bad. But I wouldn't think that Luke was rejecting him all the time.
I have to disagree with you, and I'll tell you why. It's because it was a moment where he drew the lightsaber. But remember, what led him to that moment was that he had been sensing bad things in Ben. So he had already turned his attention to Ben, noticing that there was a darkness in there. Yeah. And he thought the darkness was much worse than it actually was. And Rey actually calls him out on it because she said, you thought his decision was made for him, and it wasn't. He already assumed that Ben was done for. Ben was basically damaged goods that were unsalvageable. That's the idea that Luke had. And for that to get to that point, there had to be a rejection there at some point, a sense that, there's something off about you, kid. And kids can pick up on that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
So especially a kid like Ben Solo, I would think. So unfortunately, what I'm getting at is that all three of the main parental figures, so his mom and dad and his uncle, are the ones that are supposed to show him love and protect him, and they did, but not in a way that he felt was enough. So what Heinz Kohut calls a failure of empathy, which is at the core of the mechanism for developing narcissism. And on top of not showing him that they loved him and they valued him sufficiently, they also outright rejected him when he needed them the most. So when things were getting really bad for him and he was confused and he had this darkness in him and maybe Snoke was talking to him, mom and dad aren't there. They eventually just send him away. If mom sent me away to be with Uncle Luke, it might have been not because of what she's saying, but really because she just doesn't want to be near me because I'm scary and bad. Uncle Luke is looking at him funny, and all that leads up to this Luke wishes Ben Solo a good night sad moment. It's an important thing to understand when you look at, how Kylo Ren came to be. It wasn't just because he had darkness in him and he was evil. I don't think he was evil at that point. I want to know more about Snoke, what role he played in there, but I'm guessing he would tell Kylo Ren, you are amazing. You're the most powerful Force user ever. You're going to be greater than Darth Vader. This is your true legacy. I can imagine it was that kind of thing. So then you have somebody who believes deep down that they are flawed, because otherwise, why would my parents reject me? Why would mom send me away? And then Luke obviously feared that Ben was bad. Then you have Snoke telling him, you are wonderful. You're the best ever. I think there's a lot that can be said about that dynamic. I really like the idea of Kylo Ren using Snoke sort of as a superego, the harsh, punitive containment structure that is going to keep you in check. The fact that he goes from presumably a loving home and submits himself to somebody who will punish him and mistreat him and abuse him, it tells you that he really wants that. On some level, he believes that he's deserving of that treatment, and it says a lot about his relationship with himself. And we can go into this and talk about it for a whole episode, but it's not really the focus of today's conversation, especially because Snoke is out of the picture at this point. But going back to the topic of narcissism from a Heinz Kohut perspective, always think of it this way. You have a flaw at the core that is unbearable, and I want to build this hard outer shell that's magnificent to conceal what I think is that flaw that I don't want anybody to know about. I myself don't want to know about it. So people who have narcissistic traits in an unhealthy way, oftentimes whenever they perceive that they're going to get found out, that they're inferior, which is what they believe they are. They may not be inferior at all, by the way, but they believe they are deep down on a subconscious level. They have a lot of anxiety and they suffer a lot. They have a lot of distress. They can have rageful outbursts because they don't want anybody to know what they believe they are. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So then we have, and these are, I'm sure you guys are familiar with narcissistic traits. It's not that common of a personality disorder, but it's so dramatic, and these people can be so attractive and fascinating, magnetic, that I think a lot of the general population knows about narcissistic traits. But you have somebody who has an exaggerated sense of self-worth, right? So they think that they are better than everyone. Like, I will rule the galaxy. Well, he could, but he probably isn't equipped to be as great of a leader as he thinks he is because of these vulnerabilities in a way. Also, the angry outbursts, if I can't really tolerate distress. So if you don't do what I want, if I don't get my needs met now, I perceive that as a personal slight that's confirming to me my biggest fear, that I'm inferior. Then I'm just going to blow up and have a rageful outburst. Also, these people really need love and validation. And when you don't get it, that leads to confirmation of my theory that I suck deep down. And it reminds me of how my mom didn't give me the empathy. My dad didn't give me the empathy that I needed. They didn't show me they loved me. And so I'm going to get angry. Because remember what we were talking about in our masculinity in Star Wars. It's easier to be angry than it is to be sad. So a lot of the times, people who have a lot of anger issues, there's a deep pain at the bottom of that.
And he has anger issues.
Big time. But anger is a way of his emoting, it's a way of his communicating that pain that he's not getting his needs met. That's how I formulate Ben's characterization. They basically wanted Kylo Ren to be a really fleshed out character. So they used these traits and put it in his character as basically an archetype. He does have the traits that are very visible and dramatic, and they make him attractive, but also they make a lot of people respond poorly to him. So a lot of people just don't like him at all. And unfortunately, I don't like how they handled the lightsaber duel stuff because he came across as incompetent. I heard other people saying Kylo Ren, like any narcissist, he believes himself to be much better than he is, and he's actually inferior than the average person. That's not true. I don't think that Kylo Ren's performance in the duel against Rey is reflective of his actual force ability. There were a lot of factors there, right, that contributed to that.
Yeah, I mean, they spent they had like 3 scenes with Chewie Ballcaster just to say, look, guys, this is really strong. They even have a hand taking it. Wow, they make such a fuss of how powerful that is, and then he's hit with it. People should have had, I think the idea was that, wow, he was hit with it and he resisted and he fought after that, but I think people didn't realize it.
Exactly. The other thing is that Kylo Ren was never trying to hurt Rey. He wasn't trying to hurt her at all. He was just basically defending himself and trying to neutralize her, to corner her so that he could make his declaration.
His lovely proposal.
But Rey was just supercharged and she was going for the kill. She wasn't holding back at all. So they were in a very different place. He had also just committed murder of his dad. And that's another important thing from a psychological standpoint, because what he did there was he was trying to kill not Han Solo. He was killing Ben Solo in his mind. So Ben Solo is weak and foolish like his father. I want to be rid of Ben Solo forever because I don't want to be a projection of Ben Solo's evil. I want to take his place because I'm strong here as Kylo Ren and nobody can hurt me, or so I think. So I'm gonna...
He just wanted to stop the pain because it hurts him so deeply. And he thought that if he destroyed himself by destroying his dad, it would have stopped the pain. But it just made it worse, right? Which is good.
Exactly. And because it's all operating on a subconscious level. So he's not fully aware of what he's doing. It's all a defense, right? To protect that fragile person who suffers deep down. So he believes Ben Solo is the reason why I feel pain. Ben Solo is weak and Ben Solo needs to be eliminated. It's like basically cutting off a limb that, is rotting or not healthy. In his mind, he's going to cut Ben Solo out of the picture so he can inhabit this Kylo Ren persona and never feel pain. Of course, that's a fantasy, right? But then here he has Han Solo, who he believes is more aligned with Ben Solo, which tells you a lot again. It tells you again about how he perceives his dad. Essentially, his dad is a good man, and he knows that. But he's not here to be good. He's here to be powerful. And to be powerful, you have to align yourself with the dark side of the Force. That's in his mind. Probably Snoke helped him to come to that conclusion. So then he decides, I have to eliminate Ben Solo, therefore I'm going to kill Han Solo. Remember how boys, we talked about it before in the masculinity in Star Wars, boys align themselves with their dad and basically try to emulate the dad figure in traditional development theory in order to become like dad and be strong like dad. So now he's rejecting dad. He's rejecting Ben Solo. By killing Han Solo, he thinks he's killed Ben Solo, but that didn't happen that way, actually. What happened is that now he has more pain, even more pain than before. And so he's a mess. And in that state, he has to fight Rey and not hurt her, also not let her kill him. And Rey has tapped into the Force. And at that point, something that happened that we talked about before is that the Force basically chose Rey. The Force decided Rey is more worthy right now than Ben Solo to receive Anakin's lightsaber. And so that is how she overpowered him. So for me, that's not a comment at all on his level of skill.
No, and I think he also showed a lot of skill in the beginning by stopping the blaster, TFA, and then also when he comes and I think, like, if you talk about storytelling, I think by that point people thought, okay, we've established that he's super competent. It's okay to let him lose, but I don't know, because he has shown a lot of competence before that. Yeah, he
is, and that's something that is important too because of the Force legacy. So I think if you say that he's inferior, you're basically saying that he didn't live up to the potential of the Skywalker line, and that's why he's so angry. That you can postulate that, but that's not what we see in The Force Awakens, and it's not what we see in The Last Jedi. We saw him manipulate the Force in ways that had not been seen up until that point, with the blaster shot. That was amazing. My take is that they went too subtle with Kylo. JJ probably trusted the audience a little bit more than he should have. It should have been obvious that if you make your young man lose in combat, then a lot of the young men, and cry and all that, a lot of the young men are not going to like that and are not going to support him so much. And I think Ryan did a lot to correct that by showing Kylo Ren as a competent lightsaber wielder in the Praetorian fight, and also somebody who can seduce Rey, because indeed he did. But going back to the personality structure, there's something else, and here is just mentioned briefly Finn before we get into him later. Something else that's really interesting with the Kylo Ren and Finn moment in the forest is when Kylo Ren yells to Finn, "Traitor!" and he's so enraged. He's so angry. It's incredible. He can't stand it. He's not really talking to Finn. He's talking to himself. And that's important to realize that that's a lot of projection on Kylo Ren's part, because he is the biggest traitor. He just killed his dad. He betrayed his family. He betrayed his mom and his dad and himself. So then here we have Finn. Finn has dared to challenge him. And so there's something that's called a narcissistic injury, which is another key thing that we see with people with narcissistic traits, is that when you do something to prove to them that in fact they are inferior the way they fear, then they can't stand that. So then they fly into a rage, and that anger, it just explodes. That's what happened with Kylo Ren. So he used projection, which is another very primitive defense mechanism, to say, I'm not the traitor, Finn is the traitor, and I'm gonna destroy Finn. It shows you they have a connection there too, because it is true that Finn is a traitor, but it's also true that Kylo Ren is. So they have a lot more in common than you would think initially.
Yeah, and also if you think about it, they have this scene in the beginning where it's very interesting how he sees in The Force Awakens, he sees Finn, he sees that he's not doing anything, and he lets him. I wonder if at that moment he identifies with him. And also, I remember Monty said in a podcast we did that, he thought Finn was like his good side, and he thought he killed him, but he didn't kill him, because it was something that he was trying to kill. But I think, it's definitely.
I think you're absolutely right, Denise. I've actually talked a little bit about that before on Tumblr, where I impart my wisdom. No, mostly memes. But I did talk about that because they shared a very charged look, right? And Kylo Ren knew that something was up with Finn. He suspected it. He felt it. But he let him go. At the same time, he was fully aware of him. Yeah. So later on, he remembers when he heard there was a traitor, he knew exactly who it was. Because Finn is also an outsider in the First Order. He doesn't belong there, just like Ben Solo doesn't belong there. That there's a connection there that they have. Maybe Kylo Ren was also doubting. Well, maybe no. We know for sure he was, because he doesn't want the pull to the light. So I think, again, on a subconscious level, I don't think that Ben Solo decided in that moment, oh, he's going to betray us, I'm going to let him go. On a subconscious level, he recognized, that there was a similarity there, and so he let him go. But when he flew into the narcissistic rage, the similarity was unbearable, so he has to destroy him. But I actually think it's a very nice testament to Kylo Ren's redeemability, the fact that he didn't kill Finn. He could have, and he didn't. And I think that's partly because of Rey, because he knew that she cared about him, and also because of himself, because deep down he doesn't want to kill Ben Solo, even though he tells himself that he does. And Finn reminds him of Ben Solo. So a lot of things are operating on a subconscious level at the same time. People are very complex, and they did a really good job of making Kylo Ren seem real in that way.
Oh, yes.
There's something else I want to talk about with regards to the narcissistic traits that Kylo shows. And aside from the fact that people who have narcissistic traits are pretty grandiose, right? So they have this overvalued sense of importance. They need to be admired. And we know Kylo Ren loves to be admired because he took his mask off to show Rey how gorgeous he is. He knew that she would like what she was going to see because he finds himself attractive. Aside from that, he wanted to also make her more comfortable because she didn't like the mask. She told him that. Obviously, he had a lot of interest in Rey. I mean, the story builds up in The Force Awakens that whenever he hears about a girl, he has this strong reaction, what girl? And he perks right up, right? And when he's in Takodana and they say, the droid was spotted heading west, he's like, eh. And then they say, with a girl. Right away, he turns in that direction and goes. And obviously, there was something that interested him about a girl. We saw that Rey actually saw Kylo Ren in a vision. Before they met in Takodana, she actually had seen him. And there's no reason to think that he didn't see her as well. well. Maybe not, in her scavenger form, but maybe as a Force user. And so he was expecting there was going to be a very powerful Force user. And then when he goes and sees her, it's like, this is it. But at the same time, he's very interested in her and he looks her up and down. So there is an interest that he has in her that is, I think, sexual, but also there's something more. There's something intriguing about her. There's something he's drawn to her, even before he sees her mind. So in a way, you think about it, he finds her attractive. He wants to connect with her. He wants to have some kind of an intimacy with her. So think about when he's talking to Darth Vader. Darth Vader can't be Darth Vader without the mask. So when he's talking to his grandfather, his idea of intimacy is we both have our masks on. And when he's talking to Rey, this pretty girl, and when he's talking to his dad, the mask would be a barrier to the intimacy. So it comes off, even though, he's not the one to initiate it. Rey indirectly asked him, Han asked him directly, he complied because he wanted to connect. So that's very interesting to me. Again, it's just speculation, but aside from all that, the fact is, he's attractive, he has great hair, he's gonna show it off because he wants to be admired, he wants to see that look in her face. So there's a lot under the surface there. And then, of course, he oils himself up in The Last Jedi and he's lounging around, the way that he looks at her when he's bare-chested and she's embarrassed, he knows that she likes what she's seeing and that she's flustered. And I'm sure he really enjoyed that. I did too. But so there is that, right? But then there's another key trait for narcissistic personality disorder that is absent in Kylo Ren. It's a lack of empathy. That is one of the core features of people with narcissistic personality disorder. You really lack that ability to put yourself in another person's shoes and understand from their perspective. And that's part of what allows some of the people who suffer from this to treat others with contempt and disdain and sometimes even persecute people when they feel wronged. But Kylo Ren doesn't have a lack of empathy. That's complete, and that's important. He does, for example, in the way that he's able to kill Lord Tekka.
Yeah.
He knew him from before, and yet he was able to kill him without a second of hesitation. So there was a lack of empathy there. But with Leia and with Rey, he fully feels empathy for them. With Rey in particular, he felt compassion for her. He saw her loneliness, and he felt deeply for her in that moment, and that began their connection. And then when he provides emotional support for her when they're in the vagina cave and they touch hands and he tells her, you're not alone, and he feels for her, and you can see that she feels that from him. Yes. And that's a very important emotional connection. And Snoke accused him of having compassion. So we know he can be a loving partner to Rey. He just needs to be reformed.
Yeah, a lot. But let me just say, I was editing the video for the second part of Reylo's Endgame, and I noticed that his face when he sees Luke is the same. He does the same expression as when he sees Luke when he was a kid. You actually have the same expression, and Adam Driver is a very good actor. So I just thought, it was just so traumatic for him, that it was played out in the end of the Last Jedi, how he
You're
was
absolutely right.
afraid and he flinches and he's terrified of Luke.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, and that is something that I think was done very well by Ryan. Ryan obviously is somebody who is interested in psychoanalysis, so I'm not surprised that he put in these layers in the characterization, and Adam Driver is just such a great actor that he can convey that subtlety very well. So how do we know that Kylo Ren is traumatized by Luke? Well, because he becomes regressed right away. Regression is, again, another defense mechanism which allows people to go back to an earlier state of development. So they don't have to deal with all this because, they can't. So they become like a child again. Or sometimes people regress to the age where their trauma happened, but other times they regress to just a more primitive stage. So when you see Kylo Ren's face when he sees Luke, it's also described in the novelization. I know Mary and I talked about this scene when we did our novelization review under Star Wars Connection. It's basically like he's a kid again. The way that they're describing him, like he even does this thing where he doesn't want to look. It's like out of mind, out of sight. If I don't look, he's not really there. That's actually part of the stage of development in children when they believe that if they're not seeing something, it's not really there. So if I close my eyes, I can't, see you, you're not there. So Kylo Ren becomes basically like a boy again with Uncle Luke standing there looking menacing, and he overreacts to protect himself by saying every single gun has to be pointed on that man. And that allows the resistance to escape in that moment. So a lot of people I saw were criticizing Kylo Ren for being so dumb, that's how they put it, that he allowed himself to be distracted by Luke. Every single gun on that man, that allowed them to escape, and he lost in the end because of that. But if you think about it, it's kind of mean the way they exploited Kylo's trauma. I don't think Luke did it on purpose in a conscious way, I want to say, but he did. He knew he was going to distract Kylo Ren. He knew that Kylo was going to be overly focused on him, but he maybe didn't realize how deeply that would affect Kylo on an emotional level, that he would become regressed, to that boy who's helpless against Uncle Luke momentarily, and then he has to overreact and put every single gun on Uncle Luke to protect myself from him. To his credit, Kylo then goes down to face Uncle Luke. That's really good. He didn't hide away from him. He could have just stayed up there and then they would have been done for, but he goes to face Uncle Luke because he does believe that he is competent enough to be able to face him down in battle.
Yeah, that's actually I think that would be an important step in healing the trauma, to face it, But that's something that people who are really traumatized, they wouldn't. I don't think they would go down and face their worst fears.
It depends on if you're getting help, because sometimes a modality of treatment is what we call exposure. So it's where you just you get thrown into the water and you sink or swim. So that can help, but with Kylo Ren, also there's a bit of impulsivity there, right? Because it wasn't the smartest move to just go down like that. And impulsivity, difficulty tolerating intense emotions like anger are also traits of these vulnerabilities that we were talking about.
Oh, but I just want to go back. You're saying that he was dumb, that he didn't destroy the resistance.
That he's a poor strategist, that's what they said.
But I'm going to say he didn't want to destroy the resistance.
That's another important observation.
He was just angry. He doesn't give a shit about it. The resistance. He was just angry, and it wasn't his goal. And because even when he says, "Rey, let's whatever," he's not saying, "Let's destroy the good guys." He doesn't care. So of course he doesn't care, because he doesn't care, which is good.
I partially agree with you on that. I think he cares too much about the resistance, because the resistance is Leia. The resistance is basically an avatar for his mom. So he's got an institutional transference towards them, much in the same way Anakin had it towards the Jedi Order, by the way. When he thinks about the resistance, he thinks about the fact that they took his mom away because she was busy with them and didn't take care of him. And he also thinks about basically that is a symbol of Leia and what she loves. So even though ostensibly he's saying he wants to destroy the resistance, he wants to kill everybody in there, bring that huge phallic-shaped cannon and blow that cave up where mom is and her resistance is. He says he wants to destroy the resistance, but I think on a subconscious level, he absolutely does not want to do. I think that he really loves his mom, and so there's a little bit of a conflict there. And that's another thing I wanted to mention when we were talking about the duel earlier. I'm sorry to be jumping back and forth, but one aspect of why Kylo Ren lost the duel, I think, with Rey is that he was in conflict. He wasn't sorted out. He wasn't fully on the dark side. He was wanting so badly to be on the dark side, but he still had this light in him, and those aspects of him were battling it out internally, whereas Rey was 100% committed to her position. Rey is very black and white a lot of the time, so she had no conflict whatsoever, so all of her energy was focused into defeating Kylo. Kylo is in conflict throughout. Every time that we've seen him, he's essentially been in conflict, except for that moment when he tells Rey, let's go and do our own thing, but then she rejects him, and it causes him a narcissistic injury, and he acts out, which is another primitive defense, and he flies into a rage, and he goes over the top. So we keep seeing, this play out with Kylo and his arc. Like I've said it before, Kylo Ren is a work of art. I think he is just fantastic, and it's because they've imbued him with these qualities, When you have identified that somebody has narcissistic personality disorder, if they want to learn how to have better quality of life, we treat with psychotherapy. And what you're trying to do is to help the person. They're always going to have these vulnerabilities, but to help them cope better with that so that they can have healthier relationships and a healthier view of themselves. And with narcissism in particular, what you're thinking about is the person believes that they're inferior because they didn't feel like they were loved when they were little. When we think about self-psychology through Heinz Kohut's model, what they couldn't get from mom or dad when they were little, they can now get through the therapeutic relationship, where you feel validated and you feel like your own worth is reflected back to you so that you can then integrate that and internalize it, and then you can become more whole. So when we think about the relationship between Kylo Ren and Rey, Kylo Ren needs to be loved. He needs to feel that he is loved, and he needs to be provided that so that he can become a whole person again, so that he can unite Kylo Ren and Ben Solo, because there's a split there. So Rey, I believe, is going to provide him with that love that he needs so that he can heal that split.
Yeah, that's good. But I just have one more question. I know that people that have narcissistic disorder in real life, it's very hard to treat because they think they're so awesome that they don't need any treatment, right? Is that correct? Or am I crazy?
No. So the thing is, remember that we're talking about the subconscious and the conscious, right? So what you're talking about, the belief that they're so awesome, that's the conscious. But when you go to the subconscious, there is that injury where they believe that they are flawed, and that's their deepest fear, is that they're inferior. So a lot of the time what you're trying to do is help the person develop more insight so that they understand, well, the reason why your relationships are so chaotic, the reason why you have such difficulty tolerating what you believe is an offense or a slight, is because of this personality structure, and it's because of that belief of inferiority. And you aren't inferior. But you're in fact somebody worthy of love. Really, how far you can get depends a lot on the level of insight that the person has and their willingness to do the work and their commitment to it. So it does take a lot of work. You can't cure a personality disorder, but you can help people to manage, those vulnerabilities better.
Yeah. That's not what I was saying. What I meant was that people who have this disorder usually don't seek treatment. And I was thinking, how can Ben realize that he needs to improve? If you think of that.
Most people don't realize that they have a personality disorder, right? That's actually part of the problem, is that they believe, I'm not the problem, everyone else is the problem. Right?
What they say is that it's a very hard mental disease to treat, because the people who suffer from it, like people who suffer from depression, they go seek the doctor. If your problem is that you think you're awesome, but deep down you think you're you don't go to the doctor. So
let's talk about personality disorder for a second. So when you have a personality disorder, we're saying that you have, and all of us have some traits of the personality cluster. So you have cluster A is like super weird, cluster B is dramatic, and cluster C is anxiety type. And all of us have some of these traits in some measure. What determines whether you are somebody with a personality disorder is what traits are more pronounced to the point where they're causing you pathology. So to the point where they're causing you to have conflict in your relationships with people and conflict in your relationship with yourself. So it's a misconception that people with narcissistic personality disorder are thinking they're so awesome and they have great self-esteem. It's actually just the opposite. They suffer. If they didn't, it wouldn't be a personality disorder. Now, you're correct. Very few people show up at the therapist's office or the psychiatrist's office saying, I have a personality disorder. People who have a personality disorder, they will go seeking treatment because of anxiety, because of anger problems that are causing them either legal issues or problems in their relationships, or because of substance abuse that is a way of self-treating their issues, or because of depression, or just because, why can't I succeed the way I want? There's something holding me back. Like, oftentimes people don't know what exactly is wrong. They just know something's wrong. And if they have the insight to show up to get help in the right place, then that's a great first step. And it's the mental health professional's role to figure out that it is a personality disorder that's at the root of all this chaos. In Kylo Ren's case, if we translate all of this into how can he recover, it's about what's missing. He knows that he wants to be loved, and he knows that he wants to be accepted, and he knows now that he wants to have that from Rey specifically. And he understands that to have that love, he must begin to change himself. And I think that's going to be something to motivate him. I don't think he should change just because of her. I think he should change because he wants to. And I know that he does want to, because he's not happy the way he is. Again, if he were happy, it wouldn't be an issue. He would be Remper, and he would be eviler and eviler, and it would be great. That's not Kylo Ren. That's not Ben Solo. If he wants the love that he needs, he has to start making some changes. And Rey, very importantly, rejected him as Kylo Ren because she wants Ben Solo. That's, also kind of childish on her part, because she has her black or white thinking, all or nothing thinking. But that's a separate conversation. The point is that it was still important for her to set a line and set a boundary and tell him, this is not acceptable. You can't remain in this split state and expect me to accept you. You have to work on yourself, and then we can talk. She's going to help him integrate in the way, like I said, to heal the split. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think his pain that he describes, it would be what the thing that he wants to treat, right? Because
and he already told us, I am being torn apart. That's the schism. That's the split. He needs to be free of this pain, but he hasn't understood yet. And I think he's in the process of doing that. That moment with the dice was very important at the end of The Last Jedi. When we first meet Ben Solo, he's saying, I'm being torn apart and I want to get away from this pain. He thinks mistakenly that the way to heal himself and to stop his suffering is to completely get rid of one of the parts that is split, which is Ben Solo. But really what he needs to do is to integrate the two pieces into one again. And the only way to do that is because of love. In his case, because he can't completely kill Ben Solo. If he had, then he would be happy doing bad things, but he's not. So that's where Rey comes in, and her love is basically like a healing balm for him. And I already can anticipate haters going like, so you're saying Rey's gonna be Ben's therapist and she's gonna heal him, and what does she get out of it? Well, Rey has her own set of issues that Kylo will help her with, right? We'll get into that in a minute. But we're gonna stop here for now. In the next installment of this Psychology of the Characterization series, we're gonna talk more about Kylo Ren. Of course, we're going to talk about Kylo Ren and Rey, and we're going to talk about Finn and his characterization and the psychology behind that. And then we're going to bring it all together and talk about what we expect to see happen with these three characters based on the conflict that was presented from a psychological standpoint and a storytelling standpoint, how we expect that to unfold and resolve at the end of this trilogy. Today's conversation was mostly speculation. We have no way to know either way. I mean, it's just looking at the characterization through the lens of these theories. And you don't even have to agree on how I'm applying the theories if you're familiar with them. It's really a matter of opinion, and you're welcome to disagree with mine as long as we disagree respectfully with each other and we don't call each other stupid. I think we're gonna be fine. I think it's been great so far in the comment section. Most people have been very respectful, and it's been really fun engaging with you guys in the comments. Guys, if you liked this episode, don't forget to subscribe and remember to hit the bell icon at the bottom right corner. If you don't hit that, you won't get notified when we upload the next video in the series. So a couple of you guys have said, how come I don't get alerts? It's because you have to ring the bell. I have to give a shout out to a listener named Carifu. She emailed us in Spanish and she was like, I know one of you speaks Spanish, and it's me. I'm the one who speaks Spanish. She recommended that we watch the Psychology of Kylo Ren episodes that were done by Psychology in Seattle. And I told her, you know what? I saw that when it came out in 2016, but I agreed and I disagreed. I thought they were right to frame Kylo Ren within the context of narcissism, but I disagreed with a lot of what they said. That whole thing about Kylo Ren is inferior because he lost his lightsaber combat. I had a Kanye moment watching that. I was like, I'm gonna let you finish, but no. She was like, well, they did more episodes. I haven't had a chance to see those, but I do want to point you guys in that direction if this is a topic that you're interested in, because I think anybody who is interested in storytelling can find interesting things within psychology. And definitely that Psychology in Seattle episode, the Psychology of Kylo Ren, I thought was pretty neat overall. Anyway, that's going to be it for today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe, like, leave a comment, message us at lordsofthesithpodcast@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on social media. Until next time, may the Force serve you well.